Bonjour tout le monde. Morning, everyone. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to note the appointment of Tiff Macklem as the next Governor of the Bank of Canada. Mr. Macklem, who is currently the Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, has extensive experience in the global financial system and risk management. With his appointment, the Bank of Canada will be well positioned to help with the economic response and eventual recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to note that May 1st marks the beginning of Asian and Jewish Heritage Month. Unfortunately, we've seen a rise in anti-Asian sentiment lately, and this week, 2 more anti-Semitic incidents took place. It's important to celebrate who we are at all times and not give in to hatred or fear. When times are tough, Canadians come together. That is who we are. Le 6 décembre 1989, j'étais à Montréal, au Cégep, juste en bas de la côte de l'École polytechnique. Je ne peux pas vous dire ce que j'ai étudié ce jour-là, mais je n'oublierai jamais le moment où j'ai entendu les premiers reportages d'une tuerie à l'École polytechnique. Au début, j'étais complètement sous le choc. Je ne pouvais pas croire ce que j'entendais. Du haut de mes 17 ans, je ne pouvais pas comprendre qu'un tel geste de violence envers les femmes ait pu se produire dans un pays comme le nôtre, dans une société comme la nôtre. Every Canadian has their version of this story. Every one of us remembers the day when we realized that even in Canada, a man with a gun could irrevocably alter our lives for the worse. We remember how our sense of safety was shaken, how our worldview was changed. École polytechnique, Mayerthorpe, Dawson College, Moncton, La Loche, la Grande Mosquée de Québec, the Danforth, Fredericton, and Cumberland, Colchester, and Hants counties, Nova Scotia. These tragedies reverberate still. They shape our identity. They stain our conscience. They make adults out of children. And the heartbreaking truth is they're happening more often than they once did. With each passing year, more families are ripped apart by tragedy. More parents are struggling to explain the inexplicable to their kids. And more teenagers are growing up in a world where gun violence is normalized. It needs to stop. Last week, 22 Canadians were killed in the deadliest rampage in our country's history. They were nurses and teachers, correctional officers and RCMP officers. They were someone's child, someone's best friend, someone's partner. Their families deserve more than thoughts and prayers. Canadians deserve more than thoughts and prayers. Lors des dernières élections, nous nous sommes engagés à interdire les armes d'assaut de type militaire et à mettre en place un programme de rachat. Nous avons annoncé notre intention de travailler avec les gouvernements des provinces et des territoires pour permettre aux municipalités d'interdire les armes de poing. Nous avons aussi promis de prendre d'autres mesures pour sauver des vies. En octobre, les Canadiens ont confié à leurs élus un mandat clair: resserrer le contrôle des armes à feu au Canada. Et aujourd'hui, on tient parole. Today, we are closing the market for military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada. For many families, including many Indigenous people, firearms are part of traditions passed down through generations, and the vast majority of gun owners use them safely, responsibly, and in accordance with the law, whether it be for work, sport shooting, for collecting, or for hunting. But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer. So, effective immediately, it is no longer permitted to buy, sell, transport, import, or use military-grade assault weapons in this country. To protect law-abiding gun owners from criminal liability until they can take steps to comply with this new law, there will be a 2-year amnesty period, and we will legislate fair compensation. Now, I want to take a moment to recognize the leadership of Minister Blair on this file. Tackling gun violence has been a personal and professional priority of his for decades. He's done incredible work to make this policy a reality, and we are here today thanks to his leadership and to the leadership of people like him. Merci, Bill. Aujourd'hui, nous fermons le marché des armes d'assaut de type militaire au Canada. Nous interdisons 1500 modèles et variantes de ce type d'armes à feu par voie réglementaire. Ces armes n'ont été conçues qu'à une seule et unique fin: tuer le plus grand nombre de personnes le plus rapidement possible. Elles n'ont aucune utilité et elles n'ont pas leur place au Canada. À travers le pays, beaucoup de gens utilisent des armes à feu de façon légale et responsable, que ce soit pour travailler ou pour chasser. Mais vous n'avez pas besoin d'un AR-15 pour abattre un cerf. Donc, à partir de maintenant, il n'est plus permis de vendre, d'acheter, de transporter, d'importer ou d'utiliser des armes d'assaut de type militaire au Canada. Pour protéger les propriétaires d'armes à feu respectueux des lois de toute responsabilité criminelle, une période d'amnistie de 2 ans sera établie pour qu'ils puissent se conformer à cette nouvelle réglementation. Et nous avons l'intention de présenter un projet de loi bientôt pour assurer une compensation juste. 30 years from now, an entire generation of Canadians will remember exactly where they were on Sunday, April 18th, 2020. They will remember how their sense of safety was shaken, how their outlook on the world was forever changed. They will remember the day that they lost some of their innocence. This chapter in our history cannot be rewritten, but what happens next is up to us. We can stick to thoughts and prayers alone, or we can unite as a country and put an end to this. We can decide together that enough is enough. Today's announcement builds on the things we did during our first term. It's the next step. And there is more work ahead to implement this and pass legislation to further strengthen our laws. I've already spoken with the other parliamentary leaders, and I know that we will be able to work together and do even more to keep Canadians safe. Every single Canadian wants to see less gun violence and safer communities. So today, we take another big step forward. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and good morning, everyone. Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to take the opportunity to extend my sincere condolences to the families of those that were lost in the helicopter crash off the coast of Greece on Wednesday. We will always remember their service and their sacrifice. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today for what I believe to be a very significant and yet solemn occasion. A few weeks ago, in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, Canada suffered its worst mass shooting in the country's history. 22 innocent lives were lost over the course of a weekend rampage across beautiful communities throughout Nova Scotia. Canadians were shocked and they were heartbroken. And as we learned the identities of the victims of these terrible crimes, we were reminded of the tragic impact that gun violence can have on all of our communities, urban and rural, from coast to coast to coast. Mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and neighbors were taken from us terribly, violently, and far too soon. And sadly, gun violence is not a new thing in our society, but it's made all the more deadly with the proliferation of firearms that are more powerful than ever before. Assault-style firearms, those that were not designed for hunting or sport shooting, but they have become more and more prevalent in our Canadian retail market. And for as long as these guns have existed, they have been capable of inflicting tremendous damage when they fall into the wrong hands. And for example, in 1989, 14 women were murdered at École Polytechnique in a horrific act of deadly misogyny. 17 years later, Montreal was shaken yet again with the shooting at Dawson College. In 2014, Moncton was terrorized by a criminal that took the lives of 3 RCMP officers. And 3 years ago, in January, in Saint-Ouen, Quebec, a shooter killed 6 innocent Muslims while they were in prayer. Many of us have vivid and tragic memories of each of these events. They have become sadly a part of our history, these tragic moments when innocent women, worshippers, police officers, and innocent Canadians across the country have been killed by evil people wielding powerful guns. For decades, chiefs of police, advocacy groups, grieving families, and everyday Canadians have been calling for a ban of these types of firearms, guns that were designed for soldiers to kill other soldiers and not for recreational purposes. Guns that belong on a battlefield and not on our streets. Guns that were designed to kill people. They were intended in their purpose to kill people. And they have been used in Canada to kill innocent people. And for decades, Canadians have been calling upon successive governments for reform, for stronger gun control. And we have listened. And today we are taking action. Today, as the Prime Minister has said, we are announcing an immediate ban on over 1,500 models of assault-style firearms. And effective immediately, these newly banned firearms cannot be legally used, sold, or imported in our country. And as of today, the market for assault weapons in Canada is closed. Enough is enough. And we are ending the proliferation of these weapons and the militarization of our society. From this moment forward, the number of these guns will only decrease in Canada. We've heard many people express concern about the militarization of our police, and this is a direct consequence of the militarization of society. And Canadians deserve to live in a society where they can be safe and secure. And people from coast to coast have been clear. We cannot risk another shooting at a school or a place of worship or another attack on police officers or on women or on innocent Canadians anywhere in this country. Banning assault-style firearms will save Canadian lives. I'd like to take a moment, if I may, to speak to the law-abiding Canadian gun owners. I know from very many years of experience as a police officer that the overwhelming majority of gun owners in this country are law-abiding. They are responsible. They are conscientious. They acquire their weapons legally, they store them securely, and they use them safely. They respect our laws, and we respect them. I want to assure hunters and farmers and target shooters in this country that nothing that we are doing today or will do in the future is intended to interfere with this lawful, responsible, and legal activity. However, we are today ending the availability of weapons that were not designed for hunting or for target shooting. They were rather designed for soldiers to kill other soldiers. And while I appreciate that some may feel that these weapons have some recreational value, the tragic reality is that these weapons were designed to kill people and have been used to kill innocent Canadians. Public safety must always be our first priority. And these powerful firearms become deadly weapons when they fall into the wrong hands. Protecting human life must come above all else. These guns have no legitimate civilian purpose. They don't belong in our communities. And I will also say that the banning of these assault weapons is an important step. But let me also acknowledge that we know that there is much more to do. We will introduce legislation at the first opportunity to fulfill our commitments to Canadians, to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, by strengthening our storage laws, by preventing gun trafficking and smuggling. We will bring in greater control of ammunition and magazine capacities. And perhaps most importantly, we will bring in red flag laws that allow law enforcement to remove firearms from dangerous situations to make sure that they don't become deadly. We will empower victims, communities, doctors, families. We will empower Canadians to render their situation safe. And where there is firearms in a situation that could be dangerous, we know that situation can become deadly. And red flag laws will empower us to keep Canadians safe. We will do all of these things, and we will keep working hard to make our streets safer for our kids and grandkids. I would remind us all that over the last 4 years, we have taken real measures to strengthen gun control. We've invested over $327 million to fight gun and gang violence. That meant, for example, more resources for local law enforcement to investigate gang-related activity. It meant funding for projects which were focused on things like keeping kids in school, giving support to victims of human trafficking, and preventing gang recruitment. We brought in Bill C-71, which, among other measures, strengthens background checks to help ensure guns don't end up in the wrong hands. And last year, in the fall, we campaigned on a promise to do more. Today, we are moving forward on our promise and our plan to deliver safer streets and stronger communities for generations to come. Canada can know a future with less gun violence and less tragedy. By taking action today, we can give our kids and our grandkids a better chance at a brighter, safer tomorrow. Thank you all very much.
Merci. Bon matin. Je suis fier d'être ici en présence du Premier ministre et de mes collègues pour parler des mesures importantes et surtout sensées que nous mettons en place. Nous savons que le nombre de crimes commis avec les armes à feu a malheureusement augmenté au cours des dernières années. En 2017, il y a eu 2500 victimes de plus qu'en 2013. Too often, we have seen cases where weapons that were designed for use on the battlefield have made their way into our community and have been used to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Minister Blair mentioned tragic incidents that live in the mind of all Canadians. Mothers and fathers, children, friends, and neighbors whose lives were taken in senseless acts of violence. En tant que Montréalais, mais surtout en tant que père de 2 filles, et beau-frère de 2 femmes ingénieures, dont une ancienne de l'École polytechnique de Montréal, je peux vous dire que l'horrible fusillade de 14 jeunes femmes à l'École polytechnique est encore très présente dans notre mémoire collective, même 30 ans plus tard. And we all remember Anastasia D'Souza, whose promising life was tragically cut short at Dawson College. La tristesse et la terreur que nous avons tous ressentis ont été un catalyseur important pour un contrôle plus strict des armes à feu au Canada, notamment la loi sur les armes à feu qui a instauré de nouveaux règlements en 1995. But we have to do more. In 2019, Canadians gave us a clear mandate to act. As Minister Blair explained, today we are moving forward with this commitment by announcing an immediate prohibition of over 1,500 makes and models of military-style firearms. Ce sont des armes à feu de calibre militaire, conçues spécifiquement pour faire le plus de victimes possible, le plus rapidement possible. The new prohibitions on these weapons are effective immediately. We are, however, taking reasonable steps to provide Canadians with the time and guidance to properly and safely deactivate or remove these items from their possession. To do this, we are putting in place an amnesty order under the Criminal Code, beginning today and effective until April 30th, 2022. This amnesty period will give a lawful owner in possession of these newly prohibited firearms a reasonable time frame to come into compliance without facing criminal liability for unlawful possession. By the end of this amnesty period, all Canadians must be in compliance with the law. Il y a des règles claires sur ce qui est permis et ce qui n'est pas permis durant cette amnistie. First and foremost, anyone in possession of these newly prohibited firearms can no longer use them, even during the amnesty period. Secondly, these firearms cannot be imported or sold to individuals in Canada. Third, these firearms can be legally exported during the 2-year time frame with a valid export permit. In addition, a business owner may return the firearm to its manufacturer. Finally, these firearms must be safely stored in accordance with the law. They can only be transferred or transported for the purposes of deactivation, export with a permit, or surrender to police without compensation. Or if the person is not the owner of the firearm, to return the firearm to its rightful owner. There will be an exception for Indigenous peoples exercising a Section 35 hunting right, as well as those who use the weapon for hunting to feed themselves or their family. They may continue using firearms that were previously non-restricted for these purposes until a suitable replacement can be acquired. We are asking that no one attempt to surrender their firearm while social distancing because of COVID-19 is being practiced. As I have indicated, at the end of the amnesty period, all firearm owners will have to be in compliance with the prohibition. Le caractère d'une nation est défini par la façon dont elle réagit aux tragédies. Le pays est uni plus que jamais et nous devons continuer à travailler ensemble. Les mesures que nous annonçons aujourd'hui interdisent les armes à feu les plus dangereuses, la plus grande menace pour les communautés du pays. C'est ce que nous avions promis de faire aux Canadiens et aux Canadiennes, et c'est ce que nous leur devons, ainsi qu'à toutes les victimes qui nous ont quittés trop tôt. Merci.
Bonjour tout le monde, Monsieur le Premier ministre, chers collègues. Alors qu'on lutte tous contre la pandémie de la COVID-19, la Nouvelle-Écosse a été le théâtre de la pire fusillade de l'histoire de notre pays. C'est 22 personnes innocentes qui sont tombées sous les balles d'un tireur sans merci et sans cœur. D'un bout à l'autre du pays, les Canadiens se sont recueillis en solidarité et ont partagé le poids du deuil de nos frères et de nos sœurs de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Cette tragédie d'une tristesse inouïe nous a brutalement rappelé l'impact de la violence armée dans notre société. Violence qui a malheureusement rien de nouveau. Ce qu'il y a de nouveau, toutefois, c'est qu'elle est devenue de plus en plus mortelle en raison de la prolifération d'armes de feu de plus en plus puissantes et de plus en plus létales. Des armes qui n'ont aucune utilité pour la chasse ou pour le sport. Des armes qui, entre de mauvaises mains, peuvent blesser et tuer trop et trop vite. En 89, il y a eu l'école polytechnique. En 2006, il y a eu le collège Dawson. En 2014, il y a eu Moncton. Et le soir du 29 janvier 2017, il y a eu Sainte-Foy, chez moi, quand un jeune homme a froidement et lâchement fauché la vie de 6 frères, de 6 fils, de 6 pères. Mais si tant est que d'une tragédie à l'autre, les motifs peuvent changer, le contexte peut changer, les cibles des tueurs peuvent changer, leur modus operandi peut changer, il y a toujours 2 constantes. Premièrement, des victimes innocentes qui partent en laissant derrière eux un vide impossible à combler dans le cœur de leurs proches. Et deuxièmement, des armes d'assaut conçues et fabriquées pour leur efficacité à tuer. Des armes qu'aujourd'hui, le Canada va bannir. Depuis des décennies, des chefs de police, des groupes militants, des familles en deuil et des citoyens de tous les horizons réclament la prohibition de ces types d'armes. Des armes conçues pour des soldats en zone de guerre, pas pour des civils dans nos communautés. Aujourd'hui et pour l'avenir, on passe à l'action. Aujourd'hui, on annonce la prohibition immédiate de plus de 1500 modèles et variantes de fusils d'assaut. Aujourd'hui marque la fin du marché des fusils d'assaut partout au Canada. Mais alors qu'on va de l'avant avec cette prohibition que justifie l'importance de la vie, il faut garder en tête et rappeler à tous que l'immense majorité des propriétaires d'armes à feu au Canada sont respectueux de la loi et qu'ils prennent toutes les mesures nécessaires pour s'assurer que leurs armes soient utilisées et entreposées de la façon la plus sécuritaire possible. Mais il en demeure pas moins que ces armes d'assaut puissantes visées aujourd'hui demeurent des armes trop mortelles qui posent un trop grand risque quand elles tombent entre des mains malveillantes et que la sécurité du public doit passer avant tout. Les mesures qu'on met en place aujourd'hui, j'en suis profondément convaincu, vont sauver des vies. En même temps, on sait bien qu'une interdiction est une partie de l'équation pour réduire la violence armée au pays et qu'on doit également s'attaquer à la violence armée qui passe par la contrebande à la frontière, le trafic criminel d'armes de poing, les gangs de rue, qu'on doit aussi parallèlement investir dans la prévention qui passe par exemple par l'éducation et par plus de soutien en santé mentale. Or, le travail est commencé et on va le continuer. Le travail est commencé par des investissements de 327 millions de dollars sur 5 ans pour contrer la violence liée aux armes à feu et aux gangs de rue. Le travail est commencé par l'adoption de C-71, qui améliore entre autres la vérification des antécédents des acheteurs pour veiller à ce que les armes ne tombent pas en de mauvaises mains. Et aujourd'hui, le travail se poursuit avec un pas de plus, un pas majeur, un pas historique qui va sauver des vies et qui va rendre notre société plus sûre et sécuritaire pour tout le monde. Merci.
Good morning. I grew up on a farm in northern Alberta. We had guns on our farm, and we still do, as on many farms across our country. If there were bears around, my dad would keep a gun in his truck, and sometimes he'd hunt prairie chickens on his way home for supper. And you know what? Neither my dad nor any other farmer I knew then or have known since owned an assault rifle or an assault-style rifle. And that's because those weapons are not for hunting. They aren't for shooting a prairie chicken or scaring off a bear. They're designed for only one purpose: to kill people and to look like they can kill people. Lorsque nous réfléchissons au massacre des 14 femmes à l'école polytechnique, ou la fusillade au collège Dawson, ou à l'horrible tragédie qui a eu lieu à Port-à-Pic en Nouvelle-Écosse il y a 2 jours, ça renforce notre détermination. When we reflect on the massacre of 14 women at the École Polytechnique in 1989, or the Dawson College shooting in 2006, or the horrible tragedy in Port-à-Pic, Nova Scotia, just 12 days ago, those heinous acts strengthen our resolve. And that resolve is to close the gaps in our gun control laws and to keep the most dangerous firearms out of civilian hands. We neither need nor want such weapons in our homes, in our pickups, in our communities, or on our streets. These guns make it easier to commit mass murder, and the culture around their fetishization makes our country inherently more dangerous for the people most vulnerable, and that is women and girls. Chaque femme et chaque fille qui nous écoute aujourd'hui a une histoire à raconter d'un moment où elles se sont senties en danger ou vulnérables. C'est inacceptable qu'en 2020, le genre continue d'être un facteur qui détermine si vous vous sentez en sécurité chez vous et dans votre communauté. Every woman and girl listening today remembers a time when she was made to feel unsafe, vulnerable, or in harm's way. We all know what that's like. It's unacceptable that in 2020, gender continues to be a determining factor in whether you feel safe in your home or on your street. During this pandemic, we are particularly concerned about the rise in gender-based and domestic violence. Frontline organizations have seen a surge in appeals from women and children fleeing violence. British Columbia's Battered Women's Support Services has received 300% more calls since the beginning of the pandemic. A Toronto-based shelter has seen a 400% increase in demand for shelter. And unfortunately, this isn't new. From 2010 to 2015, according to statistics compiled by the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative, there were 418 cases of domestic homicide in Canada, with 476 victims. Of the 427 adult victims, 79% were women. Let that number sink in. In 2019, according to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, 118 women and girls died violently in Canada. On average, 1 every 3 days. Again, let that number sink in. Nous savons également que la disponibilité d'armes à feu met en danger les populations vulnérables, telles que les femmes, les personnes queer et trans, les autochtones et les personnes de couleur. Les femmes, les filles et les personnes bispirituelles autochtones disparues ou assassinées sont, selon moi, l'un des exemples les plus frappants et les plus tragiques de la violence systématique non traitée dans notre pays. We also know that the availability of assault-style weapons puts vulnerable populations, women, queer and trans people, Indigenous people, and people of color, at particular risk. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people are, for me, one of the starkest and most tragic examples of systemic violence in our society. Tackling systemic violence is our collective responsibility, one that requires us to challenge our attitudes, strengthen community support, ensure accountability for perpetrators, and, critically, keep deadly weapons out of their hands. La féminicide est un fléau dans notre société. Ça continue d'être un fléau et nous devons y mettre fin. Feminicide has long been a scourge in our society. It remains a scourge. We must stop it. In saying no to assault-style weapons, we are putting feminist ideas into practice. We are acting to ensure that our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers, our daughters, and we ourselves, indeed, that all women who have been victimized, frightened, threatened, harmed, brutalized, and killed by gun violence have not suffered in vain. Enough is enough. Assez, c'est assez. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Vice-Première ministre. On va passer à la période de questions en commençant par le téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Michel Lamarche, TVA Nouvelles. À vous.
Oui, bonjour. C'est une question pour M. Trudeau sur le plan d'urgence sur la COVID. On a énormément de courriels, de messages de la part d'aînés qui disent souffrir, qui disent avoir besoin d'aide financière. À quel moment, M. Trudeau, un plan pour aider les aînés? Ils l'attendent tous impatiemment.
Protéger les plus vulnérables dans cette situation de crise a toujours été une de nos grandes priorités. Et nous reconnaissons à quel point les aînés sont plus vulnérables à la COVID-19. C'est pour ça, dès le début, on a pris des mesures pour aider nos aînés, mais effectivement, nous avons plus à faire. Nous travaillons avec les autres partis et avec des gens du milieu pour assurer qu'on puisse envoyer de l'aide aux aînés les plus vulnérables, et on va le faire bientôt. Protecting the most vulnerable has always been an essential element and the core of our response to COVID-19. And obviously, our seniors, our elders, are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. That's why we put forward a number of measures from the beginning, but why we will continue to work on supporting our vulnerable seniors.
Donc, une précision là-dessus. Est-ce qu'on peut s'attendre à un plan la semaine prochaine? Et j'ai une question sur la PCU. Il y a bien des entrepreneurs qui vont participer à la relance et ils n'arrivent pas à trouver de la main-d'œuvre. Pourquoi? Parce que les gens décident de continuer de demander la prestation canadienne d'urgence. C'est plus profitable pour eux. Est-ce que vous allez agir à ce niveau-là pour les aider, les entrepreneurs?
La priorité ces semaines-ci, à ce moment-ci, c'est toujours d'assurer la santé des Canadiens, la sécurité des Canadiens contre la COVID-19. C'est pour ça qu'on a mis des mesures en place pour encourager les gens à rester chez eux, à se protéger et surtout à protéger nos travailleurs du système de la santé pour pouvoir avoir notre pays sous contrôle face à cette pandémie. Dans les prochaines étapes, nous commençons à regarder comment rouvrir l'économie et nous allons devoir s'assurer que les gens puissent travailler en sécurité et nous allons le faire.
Merci. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Charlie Pinkerton, iPolitics. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Will you explain how what your government is announcing today, how it will implement it without passing new legislation through Parliament?
What is being done today is being done entirely through regulations. That is a tool we have. But to move forward on the next steps, including an eventual buyback program, we will need to move forward through legislation in the House, and we will be adding further measures to that as well. I have spoken with all other parliamentary leaders, and I am confident that we will have the support necessary to move forward on strengthening gun legislation in this country when the time comes for us to move forward on legislation other than COVID-19.
So if it can do what it's doing today without legislation, why was your government not proactive instead of reactive, and why did it not put these in force earlier?
I will turn to Minister Blair to answer that, but we were ready to move forward about a month ago. We had been planning to do it in the late weeks of March. Obviously, COVID became a priority for all of us, particularly the Minister of Public Safety, who was concerned with borders, concerned with public safety on multiple levels, and we focused on that. But obviously, it remained and remains a priority for us to move forward, and that is why we are moving forward today. Bill?
Yes, Prime Minister, just to explain, there was a great deal of work that needed to be done, even though this is accomplished through regulation. We've been working very closely with the Attorney General and the Justice Department in the drafting of those regulations. There were a number of very significant issues to be addressed. We are all highly motivated by our commitments to keep people safe, and certainly the tragedy 12 days ago just deepened our resolve to move forward as quickly as possible. But we have been working quite diligently over the past several months in order to draft the regulations that bring forward these measures today. And as the Prime Minister has also indicated, there remains a great deal more work to do. And so at the very first opportunity, we'll be bringing forward legislation that will complete the work that we begin today through regulation by facilitating, and Parliament will determine a number of different important measures on how we can move forward, as the Prime Minister has indicated, with a safe, effective, and responsible buyback program, but also enable us to take additional measures that will significantly improve public safety, strengthen gun control regulations. This today is a very important first step, and it's a step that we have been working on over several months.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Catherine Lévesque, La Presse canadienne. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Je me questionne sur le timing en bon français de cette annonce. Comme vous savez, on est le 1er mai. Les Canadiens, en ce moment, se demandent s'ils vont être capables de payer leur loyer. Les petites entreprises se demandent si elles vont être capables de survivre. Pourquoi pensez-vous que c'était un bon moment, à ce moment-ci, d'annoncer là, ces mesures là, sur les armes d'assaut?
Même pendant cette période de pandémie, même quand beaucoup de la société, de l'économie est au ralenti ou même arrêtée, on a vu l'impact de la violence avec des armes à feu de façon trop tragique il y a juste 12 jours. C'est pour ça que c'est toujours un bon moment d'aller de l'avant pour assurer la sécurité des Canadiens. Nous travaillons extrêmement fort depuis plusieurs semaines maintenant pour garder les Canadiens en sécurité au niveau de la COVID-19. Mais il y a d'autres choses à faire aussi. Et c'est pour ça que nous avançons avec cette augmentation du contrôle des armes à feu et à bannir les armes d'assaut de style militaire. Okay. This is a moment in which we are very much focused on keeping Canadians safe from COVID-19, but even amid this terrible pandemic, we have seen the impact that someone with a gun can have in devastating the lives of family members, of communities in our country. That's why it is always a good moment to move forward on measures that keep Canadians safe, and that is why we are moving forward with this today. Chrystia?
J'ajouterai seulement, Premier ministre, que on voit que dans les conditions de la distanciation physique, c'est un moment quand les populations vulnérables sont plus vulnérables que jamais. Les femmes, les filles, on voit la croissance de la violence domestique. Alors, c'est un moment quand vraiment on a plus besoin que jamais de cette nouvelle règle.
Merci beaucoup, opérateur. Dernière question au téléphone.
Merci. Next question, Jim Bronskill, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Yes, for Minister Blair. Some say that one of the steps that must be taken to ensure that guns remain out of the hands of the people who should not have them are better screening and enforcement of prohibition orders when there are flags that someone should not have a gun due to mental illness or criminal history, and that there's now quite a range of discretion among officials in the justice system to whether to enact such a prohibition. Will the government move on that factor?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. And it's an important question. And I made reference earlier to the legislation that we intend to bring forward at the first opportunity. And I mentioned in particular that it includes a commitment to introduce red flag laws. And those are situations where an individual either represents a significant danger to themselves, perhaps an individual who might be suicidal, or someone who is involved in a domestic violence and intimate partner relationship, whereas there's a significant risk to that individual. And we have also seen, unfortunately, people in our society who are advocating hate and advocating violence against religious minorities or women or other vulnerable populations. And so we want to make sure that we have the tools to enable not just the police, but society, to victims, advocates, parents, teachers, to take the steps that are necessary to render that situation safe. And that's to remove firearms from that potentially dangerous situation and also to suspend that individual's ability to get access to guns. There is a work that we have done in Bill C-71 to strengthen background checks to make sure that individuals who should not have access to firearms don't get them. But we are going to take additional steps to keep them safe. Those prohibition orders, to be effective, have to be respected and they have to be enforced. And there has to be consequences for those who don't obey them. And that's why we are intending to strengthen our gun control and our gun laws to keep Canadians safe.
just a quick follow-up. There's been some discussion about how the C-71 provisions, some key elements have not yet come into force. Can you give us a timeline for that? I realize COVID-19 may have disrupted that, and that I understood there were budgetary considerations and other factors why they may not be in place yet. But can you give us a timeline for the taking of effect of the provisions in C-71?
Yeah, of course, Jim. And I will tell you, C-71 was a very significant step forward in our last parliament by our government to introduce legislation that will have a very positive effect in keeping people safe. And there remain a number of elements of C-71 which we are in the process of implementing, and they are important. Notwithstanding that we have been very occupied, obviously, in our response to COVID-19, that response has been entirely about keeping Canadians safe. And unfortunately, during this particular pandemic, we have not, although we've seen a change in a lot of society and even a reduction in a number of different types of crimes, we have not seen a reduction in gun violence. We have not seen a reduction in domestic violence. And in fact, because of some of the social distancing and social isolation rules that are in place, that risk, that potential harm has actually been exacerbated. And so we're highly motivated to move forward. Let me assure you and all Canadians, the implementation of those important measures on Bill C-71 remain a high priority for us. There is much that we are working on now towards implementation. There are some additional budgetary measures that will need to be implemented, and that will require the consent of Parliament. But when we're ready, we'll move forward as quickly as possible.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Selon les informations dont on dispose, votre gouvernement n'a pas opté pour un programme de rachat obligatoire. Ça voudrait dire que des armes qui sont visées aujourd'hui pourraient toujours se retrouver dans des résidences privées. Comment vous allez faire pour empêcher qu'une de ces armes-là soit utilisée pour commettre un acte violent?
Tout programme de rachat devrait être établi en projet de loi. Donc, nous allons devoir travailler avec les autres partis, avec différents groupes à travers le pays pour s'assurer que le programme de rachat soit la bonne, soit juste, soit équitable et soit surtout qui ait l'impact nécessaire. Donc, tout est encore en train d'être fignolé. L'annonce aujourd'hui veut dire qu'à partir de maintenant, les armes d'assaut de style militaire ne peuvent plus être utilisées au Canada et les prochaines étapes demeurent encore à venir. Okay. The measures we took today ensure that the use, the purchase, the sale of military-style assault weapons in this country end today. The numbers of those military-style assault weapons in this country will only go down from here. Designing an appropriate and fair and effective buyback program is something that we will do as part of a legislative requirement, and we will therefore be working with other parties in the House, with stakeholders across the country, to ensure that it is done right, to be both effective and impactful in keeping Canadians safe.
Donc, juste pour être certain, vous n'êtes pas encore fixé à savoir si ce sera obligatoire ou pas. Par ailleurs, est-ce que vous avez l'intention de revoir le régime de classification des armes pour empêcher qu'un fabricant, par exemple, mette un nouveau modèle sur le marché qui viendrait contourner la liste que vous avez mise de l'avant aujourd'hui?
Je vais passer la parole au ministre Blair pour ajouter des éléments à ma réponse, mais un des grands défis dans notre système de classification d'armes à feu, c'est que les manufacturiers d'armes à feu peuvent créer des variantes, des variations dans les armes qui contournent d'une certaine façon le système de classification que nous avons. Une des choses que nous allons faire en allant de l'avant, c'est de s'assurer que ce système de classification soit renouvelé constamment, qu'il suive ce qui se passe dans le marché, ce qui se passe avec les armes à feu, pour pouvoir toujours être à jour et avoir tout l'impact nécessaire pour protéger les Canadiens. One of the things that we are looking at right now is ensuring that our system of classification of firearms is ever evolving, that keeps up with modifications brought in by manufacturers, keeps up with new variants and new technologies. We need to make sure that we are constantly updating and ensuring updating our classification system to ensure that Canadians are kept safe. Bill, you have perhaps a couple.
Actually, you've covered it very well, Prime Minister. Our intent is to keep it evergreen. When the classification system was implemented in the late 90s, the system that was put in place was rigid and inflexible, and it kind of let us down because, quite frankly, the manufacturers brought in a number of different variants that got around those classifications. We will put a legislative framework in place in the legislation that we'll bring forward that will create a new evergreen framework for classifications so that as new weapons are introduced into the market, Canada will be able to respond quickly to ensure that only those weapons which are safe for use in this country will be available to Canadians.
Hi, Tom Parry with CBC. The shooter in Nova Scotia was using illegal weapons, and a lot of illegal weapons come in from the United States. So why not target those weapons as opposed to going after lawful gun owners?
Today, we are banning military-style assault weapons in this country, weapons that are designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to kill as many people as possible in a short amount of time as possible. Those guns have no place in Canada, and the measures we're putting forward will reduce the amount of those guns in Canada and eventually keep more Canadians safe. But there is more to do. There are more measures to take, and we look forward to moving forward on those. And for those, I'll turn it back to Minister Blair.
If I may, first of all, the responsibility for identifying the weapons that were used in Nova Scotia is with the RCMP, and the release of any information pertaining to those is theirs. But I can tell you that every firearm begins legally and then moves into an illegal market. And I can say with some confidence that the 2 long guns that were involved in that investigation, without identifying them, are included on today's list.
Hi, Chrystia with Global News. Prime Minister, regarding the new gun measures, can you confirm if you plan to ban all automatic rifles, and why not look at banning handguns? They are causing more deaths in Canada every year.
Today, we're moving forward with a ban on military-style assault weapons. We have established criteria that cover about 1,500 models and variants of those guns that are in Canada or available to Canadians. This will make sure that we have safer communities as of today and in the months and years to come. At the same time, there is more to do on strengthening gun control. We made significant commitments to Canadians back in 2015 and moved forward on them in the last mandate, and we're continuing to move forward on the commitments to strengthen gun control in this country, including allowing cities and municipalities the ability to restrict the use of handguns. These are things that we will move forward on in the coming months as the parliamentary calendar returns to dealing with things other than COVID-19. Nous avons pris des mesures concrètes pour bannir à partir d'aujourd'hui les armes militaires, les armes d'assaut de style militaire qui n'ont pas leur place dans le pays. Mais nous reconnaissons que ce n'est qu'une étape. Il y a d'autres choses que nous devons faire par rapport aux armes de poing, par rapport à d'autres éléments, y compris de lutter contre la violence domestique. Donc, nous allons continuer de procéder tel que promis, à renforcer le contrôle des armes à feu dans ce pays. Mais pour cela, nous allons devoir passer par le Parlement et nous allons reprendre ce travail une fois que le Parlement se penchera sur d'autres choses que la COVID-19 de la crise actuelle.
Hi, Prime Minister. Molly Thomas, CTV National News. You talked about this 2-year amnesty period for people, law-abiding gun owners, to give back these guns on this list. Does that mean that Canadians that don't comply would be fined or arrested? And how much will you compensate people that give back these firearms?
Bill?
A couple of questions, and I think the Attorney General could probably give you the details of the amnesty. But essentially, it's a non-permissive amnesty, which as the Attorney General has already explained, would allow a person who lawfully acquired these firearms to continue for a 2-year period to retain possession of them. But during that 2-year period, they can't use them. They can't go hunting with them. They can't take them to the range and shoot them. They can't sell them or transfer them. It is very restrictive on what they can actually do with the weapon, and it will have to be stored securely in a properly and approved vault during that period of time. The 2-year period of amnesty enables us to bring forward legislation that with a safe and effective buyback program that will allow those individuals who lawfully acquire these things. One of the things we're trying to avoid, the Canadians who purchased these guns did so legally. And we did not want to create a situation by prohibiting them all moving forward of putting those people in criminal jeopardy. And so we have implemented a period of amnesty to allow us to bring forward legislation and a program that will enable those Canadians who originally purchased these guns to dispose of them and not to put themselves be placed in a position of criminal jeopardy. You know, as I said, we respect Canadians who obey the law, and the law quite appropriately is now changed. And so we will do the work necessary and work with them to bring them into a lawful situation, and for all Canadians, a safer situations by the elimination of these weapons in our society.
Thank you. The standard criminal code provisions still apply. This is a regulation that derives from the criminal code. So the same structure, fines and penalties that exist for other firearms violations exist here. That hasn't changed. The amnesty is also a regulation that does give that non-permissive period where one can, in a very limited way, transport the weapons for certain reasons, but otherwise can't use them.
Compensation?
That will be determined, as we've said, through a buyback program that we'll have to do through Parliament. I mean, that requires a budget, that requires a law, and so we will require the usual parliamentary processes and safeguards, I might add, moving forward, again, with the cooperation and collaboration of our partners in the House of Commons.
It's May 1st, hard to believe, but it is May 1st, and rent is due for Canadians across the country. We know that the CERB has helped many people, but they have to choose, especially in big cities, Prime Minister, between do I pay my rent or do I get groceries this month? It's just not enough. I know this is provincial jurisdiction, but your government has stepped in for commercial renters here. Is there anything more you can do to help regular Canadian renters out there who can't pay their bills today?
From the very first, our focus through this COVID-19 crisis has been ensuring that Canadians who are vulnerable because of a loss of a paycheck or loss of a job, who don't have money coming in to be able to pay their rent or pay their groceries, get a reliable source of income. And that's why we move forward with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. That's why we are moving forward with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, so that people actually can rely on money coming in to pay their everyday needs, which include groceries and rent. We have moved forward with commercial rent support for businesses because businesses, we need them to be able to come back strongly after this pandemic is through, or after this phase of the lockdown is through. But we recognize that this is a difficult time for everyone, and we are looking to try and help. But the CERB and the wage subsidy will go a significant distance towards helping many, many Canadians get through this difficult time. Sure. Chrystia?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, it's a really good question. And I think it's also important for landlords to understand that these are exceptional times in our country. And now is a time for all Canadians to stick together and support each other. So if you have a tenant who has lost income because of coronavirus, now is a time to be really compassionate. That is the way that you support your neighbors and your country in this difficult time. And it's also a time for banks to be really thoughtful about the mortgages that those landlords have to pay. We're going to get through this, and we will get through it by supporting each other and acting together.
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Prime Minister, we know that the federal stockpile did not have adequate supplies of personal protective equipment. I'm wondering what Canadians and medical workers should be able to expect from the stockpile for the next pandemic.
The national stockpile is in place to supplement the stockpiles that provinces need to have across the country to deal with emergencies that could arise. As we've seen through this pandemic, both at the provincial level and the national level, we should have had more. We needed to have more. That's why we've been working so incredibly hard over these past weeks to source personal protective equipment and necessary medical supplies from around the world. And we have largely been successful in meeting the need of Canadians right across the country. But it took an awful lot of scrambling, an awful lot of effort that ideally wouldn't have had to happen. So there are certainly lessons to be learned going forward as we ensure that stockpiles are adequate, both at the provincial and the federal level. And that will be certainly one of the things that has been learned through this pandemic. On top of that, in terms of domestic procurement, we are seeing local manufacturers, domestic manufacturers, step up in significant ways to ensure that we have the equipment needed, not just for medical professionals on the front lines now, but as we look towards a reopening economy that will require more PPE across many sectors.
So what does that actually mean as for your federal commitment? Does that mean you will stockpile it for a certain number of weeks going forward? Will you mandate this? Will you put it into legislation? What are you actually committing it will look like going forward?
Right now, our commitment is to help Canadians going through this pandemic right now with the equipment they need, with the support they need, and our focus is entirely on filling those needs as quickly as possible. There will, of course, need to be very careful reflections about how we make sure that if this ever happens again, we are much better prepared. That is something that we are all going to be committed to. It is something that Canadians will expect and something that this government will do.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui m'a fait la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
Merci tout le monde.